The investor Q&A for February has now been translated officially by Nintendo, so let's read and talk about it. The big theme is on concerns about the impact of memory and market conditions, although there is also some insight into different regional results and how Nintendo see them. The third quarter results aren't quite such a big event as the yearly and half-yearly meetings, so the attendees are just Shuntaro Furukawa as the company president and Hajime Murakami, who is the executive officer in charge of investor relations for Nintendo. So let's start with question one, and just a reminder that this is in the context that the third and fourth quarters refer to the financial year, not the calendar year, so we're in the fourth quarter currently. Question one says, how are the rising prices for memory and other components impacting the profitability of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware? If the costs of components remain high, is there a chance of a price revision? Shuntaro Furukawa replies, we do not disclose details regarding individual components, but we can say that we are working to secure stable supplies of memory components by holding discussions from a long-term perspective with our business partners. As a result, the recent rise in memory prices did not have a significant impact on hardware profitability in the third quarter. In addition, we do not expect any significant impact in the fourth quarter. However, if this rise in component prices lasts longer than expected and runs to the next fiscal year and beyond, it may put pressure on profitability. If the situation deteriorates significantly, we will carefully assess market trends and respond. As for any future change in the price of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware, no decision has been made at this time. Any decision to change the price will be determined comprehensively, taking into consideration not only profitability, but also other factors like the platform's installed base, sales trends, and the market environment. End quote. So, this is significant in a number of ways. Firstly, this is the first time that we've seen some concession to the possibility that there might be a change with a time frame given as the next fiscal year with regard to the price of the system after the changes to memory prices in recent months. As I've noted before, Nintendo will have long-term contracts in place, and it seems that they're looking at negotiating these over the long term yet again, but of course, however long their deals are, they will only last so long. As Furukawa notes, there's a balance between platform adoption rates and price. The economies of scale of producing a consistent number of systems at a decent price actually may cushion some of the costs of the components, and so actually producing less may prove to be even more expensive to them, and so although in some respects it makes sense to jack up the price, actually it might be completely counterproductive. I remain of the view that I've expressed before, that there's a good chance, not a definite chance, but a decent chance, that they will try to protect at least the profitable American market until the end of the year, but if not, I would expect a decision to be made in the summer when they will hope that the news will pass relatively quietly. They may also be able to better absorb it if the yen remains relatively weak against the dollar, something touched on in the next question. Question 2. You explained that the change in exchange rate assumptions and the changes in the split of hardware sales by region did not warrant a change in your consolidated earnings forecast for the full fiscal year. But given the results of the holiday season, why didn't you change your sales volume forecast for hardware and software? Also, considering that hardware sales in Japan are exceeding expectations, do I understand correctly that sales outside of Japan came short of expectations? Furukawa replied, we've revised the assumed exchange rates to better align them with the current situation as there was an increased discrepancy between the rates announced in our second quarter earnings report and our latest outlook. Revising the exchange rate assumptions to reflect a weaker yen is expected to have some upward effect on net sales and each profit level, but after taking other adjustments into account, the changes did not reach a level that would require a revision to our earnings forecast. Our global hardware and software sales volume forecasts remain unchanged. However, breakdowns by region and by product are based on different assumptions than the revised forecasts announced at the time of the second quarter earnings report. Specifically, we expect that the positive impact of the weaker yen on our financials will be offset by the greater proportion of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware sales being accounted for by sales in Japan, as well as the greater proportion of software accounted for by titles of other software publishers. As for the volume of hardware sales, you are correct that sales in Japan exceeded our expectations, while overseas sales were somewhat weaker than expected. Now, it's interesting that Furukawa directly acknowledges that foreign sales are slightly weaker. This seems to me to be a reflection of them having hit that wall of consumer resistance after the initial flurry to buy the brand new system. I also should clarify my previous video where I should have noted that obviously some of Nintendo's numbers referred to inventory sold and some just to those delivered to stores. Now, while I'm sure that inventory will sell, if they have subtly overproduced, then it's quite possible that the current quarter could have some quite low numbers, keeping them around the 19 million mark for the year, which is, of course, their target. As for the exchange rate situation, it's a rather grim irony that the difference has become so marked that their relative success in Japan is actually slightly problematic to them, as it is more expensive to produce the machines and they're selling them for, in Japanese terms, not quite so much because of the weaker yen. That is to say that they're not getting as much profit as they would have done if they were selling them abroad as well. There's more of this kind of thing in the next question. Question 3. Hardware sales in Japan have accounted for a larger than expected proportion of total hardware sales. Considering that most procurement costs are in US dollars, do I understand correctly that profitability is declining due to the continuing depreciation of the yen? Also, what is the backdrop to this higher proportion of hardware sales in Japan? Furukawa says, hardware-related procurement purchases are primarily made in US dollars, so given the current exchange rate environment, the better-than-projected hardware sales in Japan will have a downward effect on gross profit and operating profit. The backdrop to hardware sales in Japan trending better than our expectations was the release of Pokémon Legends ZA, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, and Kirby Air Riders during the holiday season, building on the initial momentum of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. We believe that users in Japan saw these titles as an opportunity to transition to Nintendo Switch 2 at a relatively higher rate compared to Nintendo Switch owners outside of Japan. Okay, so this is something I've covered in one of the channel's breakthrough videos, actually. The problem that hardware procurement is in dollars and the exchange rates make this a tricky time for Nintendo when they are changing to a new console. Ironically, while the exchange rates have on balance been a real boom for Nintendo over recent years, this is one of the few times where they've been caught out a little as they're paying more to manufacture consoles and getting less of them in Japan. My guess is that they were planning around what the Japanese central bank has been proposing for some time at least, which is a gradual strengthening of the yen, or at least in line with the aims of the current US administration, a relative weakening of the dollar by comparison to other currencies, including the yen. Of course, by historical standards, these foreign exchange conditions are hardly any great problem. The Wii U era had far more trying conditions. I think what's said here about the games that made the Japanese holiday season better than expected also could reflect on what's not said and what still may be true, which is that the Japanese market was riding on Kirby and Pokemon being big sellers, but perhaps the American market didn't have quite such a strong lineup. Now, I'm not saying Kirby is a huge seller outright, but it's more about the kinds of players it brings in, early upgraders, and for what is fundamentally quite a niche game, it seems to have done this in decently large numbers. But Kirby has never been as big outside Japan as within it, and while Pokemon is huge everywhere, it also has a large Japanese fan-base contingent. Which franchises were always perceived by Nintendo as having a relatively bigger purchase on the Western and especially American consumer then? Donkey Kong and Metroid. Now look, we can argue the merits or demerits of Bonanza and beyond, and of course, Bonanza's numbers outright look pretty decent for the present moment at least, but it doesn't appear that those games have had the same effect as Kirby and Pokemon Legends had in the Japanese market, despite it seems to me being part of Nintendo's plan to cover Western-facing as well as Japanese-facing games in the scope of their opening lineup for the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, that doesn't mean that they will backtrack on games that are Western-facing in future, especially not those that are including Donkey Kong, because that's clearly going to be huge to them, but there does seem to have been a slight experiment here in putting second-string franchises front and center for the first year of Switch 2. This was smart in that it raised the profile of those franchises and moderated the huge demand surge right out of the gate, but it has exposed that Nintendo's franchises have far more pull in Japan compared to the West. At any rate, let's move on to question 4. You explained that if memory prices continue to remain high, this might put pressure on hardware profitability next fiscal year and beyond. My understanding is that Nintendo's policy has always been to avoid selling hardware at a loss. Simultaneously, I think that now is the time that you need to expand the adoption of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. Will you prioritize expanding the installed base or ensuring the profitability of the hardware? Furukawa responds, the current rise in memory prices is happening at a pace that exceeds our expectations. In general, the profitability of hardware tends to improve with economies of scale, and we want to continue to reduce costs as much as possible through mass production of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. With regard to not selling hardware at a loss, what we are focusing on is profitability on a global basis. There are various external factors such as fluctuations in exchange rates, but looking at the global picture, we have traditionally tried to avoid situations where individual units are sold at a loss as much as possible. It is difficult to predict the changes in the external environment that are currently taking place, but I think it is not an appropriate approach to be excessively influenced by short-term trends. The second and third years for Nintendo Switch 2 are very important, and if we can expand the hardware installed base, we can use that as a basis to greatly expand software sales. We will take this into account when making business decisions and flexibly consider various options. So here we can see the economies of scale point that I mentioned earlier. The more you can produce, the cheaper it generally becomes on a per unit basis. The admission that memory prices are rising faster than anticipated is curious and may be a way of signaling a potential change in their approach on prices, but also the rest of what Furukawa says is quite ameliorative. Also, the explanation that they're looking at a global basis for not selling at a loss is both understandable given all sorts of problems with exchange rates in particular markets that mean that some consoles may well be sold at a loss at some point and not others, and also effectively is an admission that they probably are pretty much at that point with the Japanese market due to the exchange rate circumstance as it stands. Now, I know that some people are scandalized that the Japanese version of the console is relatively inexpensive compared to some of the other editions around the world, but given how reliant Nintendo is on the Japanese market and given that domestic sales are likely to provide a great lifeline to the company, even if international sales become far trickier for whatever kind of reasons could happen in the febrile world we live in, it seems only sensible to prioritize this market, and given the adoption rate for the first period, which seems to be broadly in line with the Switch in terms of how the different markets have taken up the machine, it seems like they probably got the judgment right about the price point, at least up until December 2025, and that price point is one which will hopefully motivate not just the Western fans, but also motivate the Japanese consumer base, which has its own significant cost of living pressures. Clearly, if it's the case that they are starting to sell significantly more in Japan than in the rest of the world proportionately, then they may decide to adjust their strategies. I should also point out that it's a convenient myth that the consoles were never sold at a loss before by Nintendo. Nintendo have always said they don't like to sell consoles at a loss, but that doesn't mean they don't. Both the 3DS and the Wii U were sold at a loss for periods in their history. It's another reason why, again, I'm not convinced that Nintendo will rush to a US price increase, and it's significant, I think, that Furukawa talks about not responding too much to short-term trends. I also think, for that matter, that the high initial price of the Switch 2 and Mario Kart World were put out with an eye of these being a long-term price that could be sustained and still absorb various different shocks. At any rate, let's move on to question 5. If the current market situation for memory continues, do you still expect to be able to maintain the same profit margin for Nintendo Switch 2 hardware in the next fiscal year, given factors such as having secured a certain amount of components already or improvements to profitability from the mass production of hardware? Or do you expect increased memory prices to have a degree of impact on the financial results starting with the first quarter of the next fiscal year? Furukawa responds, as mentioned, we do not disclose details about individual components, but we work to secure stable supplies of memory components by holding discussions from a long-term perspective with our business partners. As a result, we expect that the recent rise in memory prices will not greatly impact the financial results for the current fiscal year. Furthermore, due to our inventory on hand together with hardware currently in production, we do not anticipate an immediate impact in the next fiscal year. However, if the rise in memory prices continues for longer than expected, it may start to have an effect on hardware profitability. In this case, we will examine various factors to determine how to handle the situation. As for the impact on financial results for the next fiscal year, we will explain during the next financial announcement. Okay, so the framing of this is interesting. The current fiscal year is probably locked anyway, as I'm sure their current inventory is being produced even now. Next fiscal year takes them into 2027, but this probably reflects that if Nintendo don't change the price in the summer, the next realistic opportunity to do so would be in January, because they're not going to want to change during the holiday season and upset all the various deals and arrangements that have been made. At any rate, Furukawa is obviously keeping his options open, but he says they will look at various factors to handle the situation, not necessarily to handle the hardware price. Almost by definition, the longer the machine is on sale, the more price sensitive their market is likely to be in the main. Anyway, this looks like it will be the theme of the next few investor briefings. Question 6 then. Inventory at the end of the third quarter appears to be higher than usual. Is this driven by a strategic build-up of components to prepare for rising memory prices going forward? Also, is it possible to secure additional inventory, including future volumes, before contracted prices with suppliers change? Furukawa responds, for the release of Nintendo Switch 2, our aim was to begin production as early as possible so we could secure sufficient inventory at launch. Even after the release of Nintendo Switch 2, we worked to expand production capacity to establish a position where we can respond appropriately if demand during the holiday season exceeded projections. As a result of these initiatives, we hold a certain amount of components and products, and these are recorded as inventory. While we currently expect some sort of impact on profitability if the increase in memory prices continues over the long term, we do not anticipate constraints in our production plans due to insufficient supply in the next fiscal year and beyond. Okay, again, it's clear that Nintendo has got a pretty good thing going with Switch 2 production, and while being able to adapt to a surge in demand is great, the best thing in many respects for ensuring continuity of supply at a reasonable cost is sufficient planning to ensure consistency of supply. Obviously, in an ideal world, you can make all the Switches you need and sell them at a snap, but given the extra costs of piling on stock, the best thing for Nintendo's circumstances is to ensure that the sales rate remains smooth. This is why I think they may have felt relatively comfortable pulling back on major games in the first quarter of 2026, but also why I think they'll have more stuff to put their thumb on the scales in years and possibly months ahead. Question 7 then. This January, a substantial free update was released for Animal Crossing New Horizons. A sizable free update was also released for Splatoon 3. From a business perspective, what is the reasoning behind releasing these kinds of large-scale free updates for existing Nintendo Switch titles after the release of Nintendo Switch 2? Furukawa responds, in January, in addition to the free update for Animal Crossing New Horizons, we released Animal Crossing New Horizons Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. Since the update, many consumers, including those who had taken a break from the game for a while, are now playing Animal Crossing New Horizons. There are also consumers who have decided to play the game again, but this time on Nintendo Switch 2. As a result, we believe we have gotten off to a good start this year. It is necessary to regularly release new titles to increase the install base of new hardware. In addition, we believe it is very important to maintain touchpoints with consumers who are active on our gaming systems as the transition from Nintendo Switch to Nintendo Switch 2 unfolds over the next few years. In that sense, by releasing updates for Animal Crossing New Horizons and Splatoon 3, which both saw high sales volumes on Nintendo Switch, we hope to create a flow where, as consumers continue to play on Nintendo Switch, they will transition to Nintendo Switch 2 when new titles that catch their attention are released. From this perspective, it is meaningful to release updates for Nintendo Switch software which has a large install base to maintain user activity and encourage continued play. Okay, so there's not too much in here, but I also don't think the train of Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades will stop here, especially given the reference to it being several years that they're looking at for the transition from the Switch to Switch 2, which of course it is. Also, their continued interest in an active user base as a core metric may well be driving the Nintendo Switch 2 edition push. Sure, it's a sensible target, but it's also one they've made one of their key performance indicators over the years, so I suspect that there is some kind of corporate-wide expectation that developers will look for ways to expand their existing libraries on Switch 2 in ways that suit each title best. Question 8 then. In the financial results explanatory material, cumulative sell-through for Nintendo Switch 2 hardware through the fourth week of December reached 15 million units, while the cumulative sales volume sell-in for the third quarter was 17.37 million units. Based on this difference, was there a higher level of inventory in the market at the end of the year compared to previous years? Also, are you keeping the projected hardware sales volume for the full year for the same in expectations of less sell-in volume for the fourth quarter based on market inventory status? Furukawa responds, while market inventory varies by region, overall it is within an appropriate range, and we do not believe it is at a level where it would impact the financial projections for the fiscal year. Whereas cumulative sell-through of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware since launch is based on data aggregated through the fourth week of December, the sales volume sell-in of 17.37 million units also includes shipments allocated for the New Year's sales season. As a result, even though the difference between sell-in and sell-through might seem large, our market inventory is within the appropriate range. Moreover, because this was the first holiday season for Nintendo Switch 2, we strengthened our production capacity to ship more units than normal because we wanted to prevent stockouts as much as possible if sales exceeded expectations. Given these circumstances, we anticipate fourth quarter sell-in to be somewhat lower than sell-in through the third quarter in line with our initial expectations. Sales of Nintendo Switch 2 have remained stable since the beginning of the year and are currently favourable. Okay, it's interesting that they overshipped to avoid stock shortages, and these of course never came. As noted by Sakana recently though, this seems to be a market-wide phenomenon within the games industry, and my guess is that the major place that they have stock building up is probably in the American or at least the Western markets. I guess that they're going to have to do some real pushing for the film. Would this be the opportunity for special Mario-branded Switch 2s, or at least Switch 2s with multiple Mario games packed in, perhaps some of the old Switch games which have upgrades, such as Super Mario Jamboree and the new Super Mario Bros. Wonder to Nintendo Switch 2 edition. They won't want too much inventory sitting in warehouses, so it seems plausible that at the very least we could see a shocking to nobody return of that Mario Kart World Bundle, which was always thought to be limited edition, but of course it's only limited edition as long as Nintendo decide that it is not going to return, and they're never going to resist for long having Mario Kart available for Switch owners at launch, given the success especially of the Switch Mario Kart bundle over the years. Okay, question 9. The Super Mario Galaxy movie will be released this April, and a live-action film of The Legend of Zelda is scheduled to be released next year. I assume you intend to continue to develop large-scale visual content, but you have also done initiatives like the Pikmin short movie. It seems like animation content other than movies will also become an option. So the question is how to combine this breadth of large-scale to small-scale visual content to increase the value of the IP. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Furukawa says, the upcoming film, the Super Mario Galaxy movie, is the second motion picture that Nintendo has been actively involved in producing, so we are paying close attention to the kind of reaction it gets. We hope the reaction to this film will have positive ripple effects in various areas, including our dedicated video game platform business. We have also announced that filming has begun for the live-action film of The Legend of Zelda that is set for release in 2027. To increase the touchpoints of our IP with consumers, we have collaborated with external partners on a variety of initiatives, but because movies and videos encompass a wide range of regions and consumers of various ages, we think it is important to first focus on these two films. At this stage, we cannot say anything about the development of other movies. The company that produced Close to You, a Pikmin short movie released last year, is Nintendo Pictures, a subsidiary of Nintendo. Until now, we have not had the opportunity to share the company's activities, but we believe this short film has been a good way for many people to learn about this initiative. We believe that there are many options for video content beyond the kinds of feature films that are released in movie theatres. If these initiatives can bring joy to our fans and simultaneously raise the value of our IP, we believe they will become valuable long-term assets, so we will continue to challenge ourselves with new initiatives. Okay, I think the most telling thing here is the reference to varied formats. Television shows or online shorts will be interesting formats for them to take on. One of my rainy day videos that I save for when I don't have the time to record new content will actually be covering this, so look forward to that video when that rainy day finally comes. I find it slightly quirky that he talks about raising the profile of Nintendo Pictures, given how little Nintendo want their developers to be in the spotlight as a rule, but I also understand that he wants to make sure that people understand that Nintendo are going to be developing their own content as well, and so this might be something that has a slightly larger profile in years to come. Personally, I'm always delighted on those rare occasions when they do developer interviews, and I would love to see developer interviews for Nintendo Pictures. Now, he doesn't actually confirm anything in terms of new releases, and of course he says he's focused on the Mario and Zelda films for now, but I do believe that they will continue to expand, especially those core 9 IPs, in order to push them into new audiences. And as I mentioned in a separate video, while in theory all of them could be ones that are pushed into new areas, it does seem to me like it's most make or break at this point for Metroid, which might benefit more from being a film or television series simply because it is more Western facing, and of course the Hollywood industry is based in America, plus the fact that they've pushed Metroid so much over the last few years that they're not going to really want to keep putting in money to the series if it's not going to show some returns, and perhaps this could be the last chance saloon for it. At any rate, let's move on to question 10. Question 10 says, last year marked the 40th anniversary of the release of Super Mario Bros., and 2026 marks the 40th anniversary of the release of The Legend of Zelda and the 30th anniversary of the release of Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green in Japan. Are you planning any special promotional activities that utilize these IP assets? Frogcar responds, as was announced regarding the 40th anniversary of Super Mario Bros., in addition to a number of software titles, we also plan to release the Super Mario Galaxy movie as an initiative outside of our dedicated video game platform business. As the debut of the movie approaches, we hope that even more people will pick up Super Mario Galaxy plus Super Mario Galaxy 2, which was released last year. In addition, we are planning to release the new software titles Mario Tennis Fever, Super Mario Bros. Wonder Nintendo Switch 2 Edition plus Meet Up in Bellabelle Park, and Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, and we expect these will provide opportunities for many people to come into contact with the world of Mario. Right now, we do not have anything specific to share about initiatives other than the 40th anniversary of Super Mario Bros., but 40 years and even 30 years is a very long period of time. We are incredibly thankful that consumers all around the world have loved the characters of the series for so long, and we will do our best so that they can endure even longer. Well, he wasn't going to scoop any announcements here, was he? But I personally think that there will be more to come. My bet remains on Pokemon being celebrated on Pokemon Day, but Zelda being more of a focus later in the year, probably in September. If there's any big anniversary that probably won't get much of a look in this year, it's the 40th anniversary of Metroid, but even then, I could see there being some kind of small announcement on Nintendo Today. Also, he does mention specifically selling more of the Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2 pack, which I can imagine being a bigger focus, given that, as I said, it doesn't seem like it's sold enormously well out of the gate, possibly due to pricing, but also, I guess, as we get new people who are experiencing the film for the first time, they're probably anticipating that people will pay a slightly elevated price, and so it might become quite profitable, especially given, I would imagine, that despite the clear efforts that have been put in to improve it, it's a relatively high margin endeavour for them. As I say, a relatively uneventful Q&A, but still some interesting bits along the way. Thanks for watching, hyping, liking and subscribing. Please consider checking out the Patreon, but if not, thanks so much for watching anyway, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.